Hi, I'm Roy Moore with the Scout Patch Auction, and this is another one of our Masterclass Expert Class series of specialized collecting areas with experts in the country. And I'm joined by Ron Aldridge here in Dallas, Texas area. So Ron, glad to meet you. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for joining us.
Roy.
Literally, Ron wrote the book. Actually, not one book, but two books on Order of the Arrow at national events. And in this one, we're going to talk about Order of the Arrow at national events, and we'll do another segment here on Order of the Arrow at Grand Lodge meetings, national meetings, and some of the memorabilia around them. We were just talking before we started this about when you started collecting. I was thinking it was the 64 range, but no, you said you go back to 50. So how'd you get started in collecting, Ron?
Well, I started collecting like everybody else, I think, trading patches at camporees and things like that. And that was a lot of fun, and I was enjoying it. And then I went to the 1961 NOAC.
Where was that, Indiana?
Yes, Bloomington. And I discovered Order of the Arrow patches. And I had a lodge that I wasn't allowed to trade. We had an odd shape that we were allowed to trade, so I was going around trying to trade my odd shape for flaps.
Okay.
And I just got all excited about this hobby, and that was the beginning. And you know, it hasn't ended yet.
Well, here we are 50, 60 years later, and you're still at it and going strong and still adding to your collections and stuff. But it does create a passion. I do remember you and sharing the experience of you and Hal Yoakum acquiring a collection from a senior collector at that time out of McGee-Opegon, Detroit Area Council. And you were getting in that collection Chicotees and Hannegas's, but Chicote only emerged 4 or 5 years, 7 years later. If this was 1964, Chicote
Right.
only emerged in 1957. So that's easy. That's common in that regard. How did you get into? And actually, you were doing primary research on tracking down Order of the Arrow at national events. What tripped you into this specialized area?
I think I got into this area because nobody had really done it right.
Right, it had not been studied, never. What people might not know who haven't, on Ron's history, he was the first author of the Region 7 Order of the Arrow collecting book a few decades ago. But Region 7 went out in
1965, that was published.
Okay, I have a copy of that book. But so he did an issue collecting book and a lodge registry in 1965. Remember, folks, this is the era of personal computers and the ability to easily print things. You're sitting at a typewriter, type it up, and even copiers were hard to think. You're using mimeograph machines.
And there was no blue book.
There was certainly no blue book as we knew it. I don't even think Dave Lubitz's blue book was out. It actually would be before the Bill Price book.
That's correct.
In the late 60s that a lot of us went with, where he had patch pictures. So there's a hard piece of nugget to go find, but an old Region 7 collector's guide that he wrote back in the 60s. And so in your 50, 60 years of collecting, nobody really had done a documentation, particularly of the early years of Order of the Arrow. And what do we mean by Order of the Arrow at national events?
Any national event where the Order of the Arrow took place. And it wasn't just the NOACs, it included all kinds of different kinds of events. But
I mean, we have some NOAC, but you also, particularly it's in the jamborees or other signature events.
Correct.
And we're going to talk about some of these early years. What tripped you into, it hadn't been done. Frankly, we didn't know who some of these people were. You were
That's
contacting original members and attendees. I'm going to bring the camera in here. We'll see how this works out. Yep. This is, you've had this medal. Have you ever had this pin?
I've never owned it, but there are 2 or 3 in existence.
Yeah, he's labeled as 1927 NOAC, but they weren't called NOACs then. They're the National Grand Lodge meetings, the annual meetings. And
Right.
again, in 27, I don't know how many lodges were chartered by then, but probably less than 50.
Not very many.
No.
And in addition to the pin, they had a wallet.
Well, and you have one of these wallets.
I do.
I'm going to back up the camera here, so bring him back in, but you showed me this the other day. This is actually only the second one I've ever seen, frankly, the best conditioned one. I mean, if we're talking rare memorabilia in our hobby, this is an example of it. It is, what, Describe this.
Yeah, 1927, and it's in perfect condition. And this is when the dollar bills were much larger than they were today, which is why the wallet is as large as it is.
Well, and it was held, as it says on here, sometimes I recall a reference to Camp Ranachqua or Lodge
That's
4,
correct,
the
yes.
Ranachqua wallet. There are a few of these specimens in the hobby. Again, how many in this kind of condition have survived? But the lodge and the movement, or the Boy Scouts in Order of the Arrow, was much, much smaller 90 years ago. That's really what we're looking at, is 90 years now on something like this. And so to find something like this, but it is out there, it is a collectible. There's also like a comb case or something from.
Yeah, I never owned that one.
But what is it?
And I've never been able to validate it, so I haven't included
Yeah,
it.
rumors of, in essence, a leather comb case or something that is that ties to that. But you actually have finally uncovered something earlier than that. Talk about this.
Yeah, during my research to do the books, I have been told about a 1924 wallet that existed, but I had never seen it. None of the museums have it. I have never found anyone that had one, but I kept hearing that this thing existed. Well, just recently I was able to purchase one, and it's very clear to me that this is not only old, but it is a 1924. It's exactly what was described to me by a couple of old codgers when they told me about it. And it does exist.
Yeah, from the Grand Lodge, it's not attributed to any single lodge, but as
No, it was for the meeting.
A presentation piece for the meeting. Where were those meetings held? Did you track that down? Well, this one was at Ranachqua.
My book says where the various meetings were held.
Okay.
I don't have it in my head anymore, probably due to my age.
Well, but yeah, your reference material talks about each one of these meetings.
That's correct.
Even if, and well, as current and as deep as those books are, we are still discovering, and actually it makes one of the fun things about this area of collecting, that we are still discovering pieces of memorabilia. Oh, there's what's believed to be the
Yeah, the 24 meeting was held in
Trenton.
Tuxedo, New York,
Tuxedo,
at Kanawonki Scout Camp, which is one I've never heard of before.
No, I wonder if it's a sub camp at 10 Mile Rivers or something.
That could well be. I would suspect that that's probably true.
Let's go on to some of the other more recent period pieces in here, as if it's more recent. 1933. No, there's a collector friend of Ron and mine who talk about that anything we know about the Order of the Arrow memorabilia prior to World War II is almost by accident. The the lodge was much smaller, the movement was much smaller, it was not national. There were other honor programs at other councils around the country. It was not the national Senior Scout Honor Society. But it was still very active in its own right, and so it did have these periods of grand meetings. 33 national meeting. What were some of the insignia there?
They basically had a rectangular pin that each delegate got, and the ribbon hung below the pin.
Okay, and
there are two in existence at this point in time.
And then on to 36. These were every 3 years, 2 years? It varied. I mean,
it varied.
Yeah,
it did
there
vary.
wasn't as consistent again.
Because they were trying to establish the Order of the Arrow, and they kept growing it and having meetings to make it bigger and better.
And bring together and share experiences and how to run a lodge and
Right.
make for strong
And
lodges.
it wasn't until 1948 when they actually joined the Boy Scouts of America.
Or that it actually became approved by the National Program Committee or something. I mean,
Right.
it was always part of the Order of the Boy Scouts of America. But Gimagash existed, and Kunier, Mikase, some of these have continued on, Firecrafters, and others that are...
But they had a marriage in 1948.
Right. Before we get to 48, 36, there's a name card that exists for this.
And that's it. That's the only thing we have is the name tag in 36. Also in 38.
And so there's sort of a close-up. You've got a real specimen here for both of them. Again, they're incredibly obscure and hard to track down. I don't know if we have delegate records. More recent NOACs in the 60s, I know we started keeping counts of the number of delegates. What got me excited, besides some of this 30s era vintage stuff, was you also then started to track down service troops and actually discovered, like, this service armband from the 1950 Service Corps was for the Order of the Arrow Service Corps.
Yes, it was. And there were some collectors that had this armband with the S and didn't have a clue what that was.
Right.
But that was our first totally Order of the Arrow Service Corps. Prior to that, in 1937, there was a service troop, but that included the Knights of Dynamis, it included the Alpha Phi Omega service people, as well as the Order of the Arrow. So it was several different groups.
Several different groups that both are incredibly scarce, hard to see, hard to find, but potentially out there. And again, people might not know. I mean, there's nothing on here. It's hard to read, but you could tell that was Boy Scouts of America. Nothing on here that would indicate it was Boy Scouts of America. The big, were we still called a Grand Lodge, or was this a National Order of the Arrow Conference? It might have been a Grand Lodge meeting still.
I think it was still Grand Lodge.
1940 at Camp Twin Echo, up in East Burroughs Council, northwestern Pennsylvania territory. A neckerchief, one of which is a delegate neckerchief, and then a staff neckerchief that had the Annika chenille on it.
It had the Annika's name at the top.
Annika's name, and it said CTE 40. But then there's also this wonderful medal for your name would go in here, as well as then a drop pendant.
And there was two versions of the medal. There was the one with the two little pins here, which was made of aluminum, and then there was one made of steel, which is rarer.
You ever hear why they did it? They're just whatever in the production process.
My understanding is that the steel ones were made because there weren't enough of the others, and they had to make a few more for some, for the ones that didn't get one.
Well, and this was like a staff patch for...
That was a staff patch for the camp that was given to the staff of the NOAC, and the camp patch.
This is a camp patch.
Was also given to the delegates at the NOAC.
And you'll find a camp patch that's in reverse colors, that is red lettering against a white field. This is the headquarters territory for Standard Pennant Company. So, Annika's, their basic patch was a chenille patch. They didn't have a flap until the very end of their lodge in the late 60s. So it's this white lettering against red that is the NOAC version of the patch.
That's correct.
Right. Now we start getting to national meetings, and actually 48 where it becomes, when they call it a national meeting, this is what we start thinking of as NOACs. There is a twill patch, I believe, for the 46, but we are believing that that's really a contingent piece.
It's actually a felt one, but
felt. Embroidered on felt.
It's a contingent of some probably Midwestern council
that went to this meeting. In some reference books, earlier reference books, made reference to it as being a staff patch or prototype, but a few have surfaced. We've seen them in the Midwest, whether they're out of Indiana or they're out of potentially Chicago, but otherwise really no documentation that would indicate it's anything other than a contingent piece. 48, we have the standard felt patch, which is the first of the patches that got into the reproduction series. What was it, 73 that they did the reproduction series? And there are people who...
75.
75, that goes through 73. The National made a reproduction set. In 73, they'd done reproduction sets of some Jamboree patches and region patches, very popular to sell. They sold a lot of them. Well, the NOAC and the Order of the Arrow folks said, gee, this is a good idea, let's make more. It can confuse people because it is printed on felt, but it's not flocked on felt. And if you actually compare it, there are detailed differences in the size of the lettering and other nuances that, again, people could be confused. But you've also got the twill patch, which is much, much rarer.
Right. The twill patch is considered by 90% of collectors to be the staff patch. There are 10% of collectors that believe that that was a contingent patch of the Chicago Council. But all of the research that I've done validate that it is a staff patch.
Okay, and that it existed that way. And then it goes on. There's certainly the standard NOAC patches that you might recognize. And again, your book covers much more depth than this. Versus this display frame, but you've got some of the name badges and this kind of ephemera. that's 1950 NOAC, that's 70 years ago, folks, to have even name badges from that to survive. Here, again, you continue some of these Jamboree Service Corps, which is a very popular collectible in the hobby. To have Service Corps, most people are lucky to see the 70s stuff. It's at the bottom of the frame or in his book, get his book to really see them. Talk about these Jamboree, what you've discovered in exploring these Jamboree Service Corps pieces.
These Service Corps were just Order of the Arrow, and they were very rare. And it was a very small group of people, and they each got one, which is why the patches are so hard to come by.
Right.
These two patches will sell for $600 easily, and often more.
Well, again,
because there's so few of them.
I've been doing my patch business for over 30 years, and I'm not sure I've had either of these come through. GHQ, General Headquarters Service, is what that represents. Order of the Arrow. There are some, again, Alpha Phi Omega, I believe, or some others. There are some Jamboree collectors that have that. We're going to, I'll scan down here.
I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I said 500. I meant 5,000.
Yes, I was going to say
5,000 or more.
Yeah, yeah.
For these two pieces.
Yes. This is sold in the $1,500 range for the 1950. But again, that actually has shown up in some others. But there's others of these service patches down here for different 60, 64, that 73 says 73 on it. I'm getting estates and collections. You are too, Ron. We just don't see this stuff come in.
No, not anymore.
No, and it even in the 70s era, or these armbands, and are they out there? Probably still, but really, if it's not in the collectorate group, it is not available, and other than...
And the sad thing is so many of these things have been thrown away over the years. Yeah. It's like people, my parents, while I was away at college, threw away my baseball card collection of over 10,000 cards. Huge value. Well, the same thing happened with Boy Scout patches.
Exactly. Well, for me, it was Disney comics from the 50s and 60s that got pitched out when I'm off to college and stuff like that.
Right.
With Mom and Dad Disney. And you get into some of these pieces of memorabilia. If you look here, nothing on here says Boy Scouts of America. So that makes it even more obscure for people to have, to know that it relates to a national program. Even in some of these cards, if you didn't know what the Grand Lodge Order of the Arrow represented, you might not know where that ties into. Mm-hmm. This display goes on up into NOAC and Philmont bases and into the 80s. But we're going to do another segment here on National Committee member patches. It's a fun area. It's got some depth. There's some easy stuff from the recent years to track down. And there's still stuff we're discovering, and there could be name badges for some of these still to be found or added to the collection. Some of the paperwork for these national meetings is fun and hard to track. You've got on here, this is the first chorus and band patch down in 52, so that's another way of extending it. What's this patch here, down here around this one here for 63?
Yeah, that was a service corps that was done after the NOAC. And there was just a few people that were chosen to go to that, so the patch itself is rare. And the event, the people that were allowed to wear that, probably no more than 15, 20 people total.
I've never seen one before, other than in your collection. You've got, I think, all three colors of the 73 Jamboree or NOAC service or participant pin. Those were the one per participant or one per staff or one per national staff pins. Separate videos that I just recently shot with Michael Feigenbaum. He actually designed those pins. So folks, again, Roy Moore here, Ron Aldridge, and Order of the Arrow at national events. And again, welcome to our masterclass. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ron.